just turn you. Right. As ever, nice and easy and gently. Work at your own pace. And if you're not sure what that means, then just go gently. The idea is never to feel as though you're experiencing some kind of boot camp, but rather to just be aware of what's going on within the inner landscape of your body in the first instance. And eventually, of course, to find the connections between that inner landscape and your outer environment. So just focus your attention on the posture, the movement, standing with your feet hip width apart, and just turning in the center of your body here. Try and do it like this rather than, you see my knees going from side to side here. You don't want to strain the knees. Your weight slightly forwards, hips dropping back. So some of you will be familiar with these elements of the posture. What you may get in those circumstances is a sense that something's not quite right. Once you settle in, oh, well, what's wrong there? If you're not too sure overall of the posture and what you want to be doing, then you kind of approach it from another way around and think, well, you know, where are my shoulders meant to be, where are my hips meant to be? And we're looking roughly for parallel lines, shoulders, hips, outside of the feet. And parallel lines coming up through the body, so the floor, and then say the hips and pelvis, maybe the solar plexus and the shoulders. So we have this sort of grid, like you see on a map, and we arrange ourselves within that grid, but without any expectation of keeping straight lines in our body. There aren't any straight lines in your body. Those are just ways of orientating yourself within that landscape. You breathe in, maybe something that you're comfortable focusing your attention on. And have a sense of gathering your attention rather than forcing yourself to concentrate, drawing your attention around what's happening in your hips or your breath or the rhythm of the movement. And when you feel that you're drifting away, rather than force yourself back, which is a very stressful process, I think, just sort of nudge your attention into something else to do with the practice. So if you're focusing, say, on the middle part of your body, which is a good area to focus on, as some of you know, but you feel yourself kind of drifting away and thinking about lunch or whatever, just sort of come back and maybe pay attention to your shoulders or whatever. So again, concentration is not necessarily a helpful term, I think, when we do this. But we gradually learn to hold our attention in a certain area. And again, we might think of that as the inner landscape of the body. And the various elements that make that up. Now, some of you, I've talked about various things, everything from routine to the opposite movement and so on and so forth, all of these things. They're all a part of that inner landscape. There isn't necessarily in the first instance a right or wrong thing to focus your attention on. So whatever helps with that gathering process in the first instance is useful. And then just raise your arms a little bit. Another way of thinking of this is that we gradually build up a picture. light them over, a bit like doing a jigsaw, you know, we get a corner over here and a bit in the middle over there, and gradually this picture emerges of what is happening within the body. And give your legs a shake. I try and use a variety of approaches because I don't think any one approach necessarily works for everybody or for anybody all the time. To be honest, when I use an image or an idea that sort of grabs your attention, then feel free to make use of it. If it's something you think is interesting but you don't understand, then ask questions. But also recognize that some of these things take a little while to absorb. So something I say today might not have an impact, but maybe in a month's time or something like that it will do. So feet hip width apart, toes pointing forwards or very slightly turned out, so that everything is, if you like, looking in the same direction. You're not kind of standing with your hips facing one way and your shoulders twisted around or something like that. So again, we have this sense of coming into line, body aligning itself to itself, but also to the pull of gravity as it works through your body. So from the side, now just start rocking your weight forwards and backwards gently. And notice when that starts to happen, when you've gone too far forwards, that'll probably be round about the ball of your foot. Likewise, going back, maybe the front part of your heel. And recognize that if I take the pole here, that here, you see, what I'm really doing is swaying away from that pole, coming back through that line and then back, and so on and so forth. And the further I get from that, the more likely I am to stumble or to stiffen up, tighten up. So we want to try and get a sense for what it's like in that middle point, that point of equilibrium. Because what we want to try and do when we move is not necessarily keep that equilibrium all the time, but actually keep in touch with it, shall we say. So again, you know, if this is about exploring a landscape, and in the landscape, that straight line, that pole, becomes a sort of landmark. So you might, you know, be somewhere and you're exploring, but there's maybe there's a hill up there with a church on top of it or something like that. And every now and then you look up and make sure that you can still see it, and you don't get lost within the landscape. And notice the changes in your body as you do this. You know, where do you feel the tightening? Where do you feel the movement? What muscles are being used in your legs, your back, maybe your chest as well. I sometimes have this image going from the side that when I go, you know, from the crown of my head down to the ground, there's like guy ropes or elastic thread that you might use to hold up a tent. And as I go in one direction, there's a contraction in that direction, but an expansion, a drawing out, and then a contraction behind me draws me back. And one of the things we want to try and do, again relating to this midline, is to find the point where, if you like, the guy ropes are pulling equally. It's not that they're not working, you know, the muscles, tendons, ligaments, the fascia, and so on and so forth are all working, but not under strain. And in this mid position, with a sense of harmony and with a sense of equality about them, I suppose, the same feeling of pulling, so that eventually we come to rest. And some of you will have an idea about where you would come to rest, but letting yourself come to rest in that point of equilibrium, and feel that you're held and supported by your body rather than that you have to strain to hold a position. You feel this stronger feeling in your legs, certainly, but also imagine that going up through the middle of your body, through your spine perhaps, or something like that, so that there's this structure, this framework within your body, and soft tissue and areas like the ribs are sort of draped around that frame like a garment draped around a tailor's dummy. So these are all things that we want to try and recognize as closely as possible, and not just the physicality of it, but more importantly, the feeling of it, because that feeling is something we want to maintain as we go through the different exercises. And let your hips drop back just a little bit. Try not to push your knees forwards, hips dropping back as though you're sitting back on something, and just let yourself drop down a little bit further and pushing up. Sinking down. So you drop down, you feel your legs being loaded like a set of springs, and then you feel the push up. Imagine doing this on something like a trampoline or a bouncy castle or in water. You'll sink down and eventually you'll feel this push up coming up through your body. This represents one of the most fundamental of the energetic cycles in Tai Chi and Qigong. We're not concerned purely with the mechanics of the movement, of course. So this idea of the flow, the energy is there as well, but not as something separate from the physical body, something that moves through that. We yield, we allow our center of gravity to be drawn down, let the center of gravity drop as low as possible. And then we feel the response of the body pushing up. And indeed, we might even feel the response from the ground underneath. If you try this on different surfaces, you may get a slightly different feeling. So the whole kind of energetic cycle, well, not quite the whole, because we breathe as well, don't we? But just focus on this major element as well, comes from that willingness and the ability to allow gravity to just draw you down. So if I go back to where the pole is, this is quite tricky to do this, but as I sink down, and you see, it's like I'm sliding up and down that pole. If that doesn't happen, if, for instance, I begin to sink down and my bottom sticks out, I will fall over. So just notice where things like that are happening. Pelvis and hence the lower back are key places, as I've mentioned before to some of you. Don't force yourself to hold a position. If you go to sink down and you feel a bit kind of wobbly, try and just rest in that position and work out what it is. You may want to hold on to something to support you, but it can be very, very subtle. It doesn't always take a lot. It's like having a set of kitchen scales and trying to kind of weigh out things. You might, you'll kind of shoot over. You'll gradually learn to recognize those areas where there is some kind of holding. So in the way when I just showed you, what I did was I stiffened up my lower back, and when I stiffen up my lower back, that starts to happen. And then bring your hands around in front of you, sink down, so you're cradling the ball, just pushing up. And you'll start to feel a little bit more of a response in your upper body as your arms begin to move. Again, don't concern yourself overly with exactly where that response should be felt. It can vary a little bit, but some of you will be familiar with the idea that this exercise, it tends to be emphasized here, a bit of expansion and contraction. The body expands from the ground upwards and then sinks down. Remember, in the sinking down, you're trying to allow your center of gravity to drop. Having allowed your center of gravity to drop, when you push up, don't lift it up again. Imagine your center of gravity is a bit like a kind of steel ball, like a ball bearing or something like that, that drops into the ground. And then as you push up again, it's attached by an elastic thread, which stretches out and then eventually draws you back down. So we expand out of the root, as we call it in Tai Chi, a bit like a plant grows out of its seed or out of its root indeed. And that can help us to stop over-moving, overextending. And then changing to the wild goose. With this image of the bird in flight, or alternatively, a feeling of just waving a feather up and down in the air. These images are a key way that we engage our awareness, our minds in the whole process. So now we have the three elements, the three jewels as they're sometimes referred to, the physical body, the mechanics, physical connections, the movement, the energy that flows through those connections, and various aspects of our mind, our thoughts, our intent, our response to images, our memories, and so on and so forth. All three of which interact with each other. One more of the wild goose. And then parting the clouds. Expansive movement, but not a stretch. Notice my elbows are still quite bent. Somebody mentioned before the class started, the sun was out. Imagine how you feel on one of these grey days that we've been having, when suddenly the cloud breaks and the sun shines through. That sense of opening up, not just in the body, but in your energy, your thoughts in a way. Excuse me. Now, we're going to link these movements up into a little sequence. So bring your hands around so you're cradling the ball. And then one of each. So always remember, if you get lost in the sequence, it's not the end of the world. Changing now to the wild goose. And then changing again to parting the clouds. Just to give you a chance to recognize the changes within your body as you go from one movement to the other. Obviously, there's a lot of connection or similarities between these three movements, maintaining that rising and falling of the hips, The rhythm of the movement goes through all of the exercises that we do. They're all part of that same inner landscape. And yes, at the same time, like any kind of landscape, there's a variety of routes, a variety of pathways. And each individual exercise also has its own unique pathway through the body, working from principally from your feet upwards and outwards. And a lot of the progression in Tai Chi is really about recognizing those, training your awareness to recognize those different internal movements and changes. The repetition and the linking up of movements, a key part of that process. Hence this very simple little sequence, just to remind you of that, to introduce that idea to you. One more round of this. And then let your hands drop down, there's a contraction, and the next part will be an expansion, and expanding through one side, pushing your elbow out, then letting it drop down so your arm goes up, rotate as though you're plucking an apple off a tree, and pull down. And again, push up, rotate, and pull down. This is dragon plucks the stars from the sky. Alternating from side to side without rushing. I'll be on this side now. Try and make sure that you give yourself the opportunity to finish each movement before you begin to transfer your attention to the next side. This is where paying attention to the movement, paying attention to what's happening in your body produces tangible benefits for our minds, slowing down. What you may well find, and what is often the case, I've seen this many times, I've done it many times, is you get to about here and you're sort of twitching, you're trying to start, move on the other side. Just remind yourself you've got time, space. You don't have to rush into doing several things at once. So what looks like a sort of pause in between the two sides is actually a period where my attention moves across from one side to the other, from one foot to the other, like a camera panning across the landscape. And those of you who are experienced with these movements, there are many points where there are those, what I've just described as a pause. It's not a very good way of describing it, but what is described more poetically in the Tai Chi classics is the quality of stillness within the movement. One of the things that is going on here when we pause is, I've already said my attention is shifting across, but at the same time, I'm just trying to let go a little bit more in my lower back to reaffirm that quality of being rooted. Now, bring your hands to your sides. pushing up. Slowly down. Just do the first and the last section of this exercise to begin with, pushing out to the side. Notice the change probably in your back. I say probably because we all experience these things slightly differently, but you want to keep your hands in front of your body. That keeps your back feeling broader. So it feels like somebody's massaging your back here, just stroking out sideways. And here, lengthways. So again, a little contrast there. A very slight gathering pause in between. As you get more familiar with these exercises, try and focus more on those pathways, those very unique patterns of movement. And it can be quite interesting to notice the relationship between those and your awareness. With an exercise that you're familiar with, you create an expectation, there's a memory of how it can feel. You may find that that expectation, that memory, that intent actually begins to produce the exercise for you. Because these small changes within the body represent the building bricks of all the movements. So they're the way in for the mind to really influence movement. And then pushing out and turning. And finishing with the sideways push. So again, our bodies provide a focus for our awareness, a resting place for the mind. That can build an awareness of the dynamics of the movement and those pathways within the body, which in turn can be affected by that focused attention, and so on and so forth. That's just one of the sort of interactions, if you like, between body, mind, and energy. But we learn what the correct ways of moving are by observing our movement, by keeping as relaxed as possible, and in a way by trusting that the body knows how to learn. So we're not trying to impose some kind of control over the body. That's very important to realize. Do one more round of this. Your hands drop down again. Put the fingers of one hand back and let that draw your arm around, your elbow slightly bent. So the opening on that side of the body till your hand reaches your center line and then straight down. Circling palms. Imagine you're standing beneath a stone archway like you might find in a church and just sliding the palm of your hand around that arch. If that's comfortable for you, second stage of the movement, you can just add this little turn. One more time. And then change sides. Notice the difference between one side of your body and another. And your arm being pushed out by the expansion in your side. And then at the turn, it's comfortable for you. And then let your arms rest for a moment. Go back to this movement, sinking down and pushing up. Now, earlier I showed you this, and before that I said, you don't want to lean. So if I lean, my whole body tilts. My knees are going away from that line and so on and so forth. For these next couple of exercises, we're going to tilt on the hips. So what will happen is the hips will go back and you'll see my knees stay more or less in the same position. This is tilting. This is leaning. So we can tilt quite a long way because there's this counterbalancing movement from hips, lower back, going down, and we keep, and to come back to the upright position, we allow the hips to drop down. Imagine if you were doing this and somebody stood behind you, place their hand on the back of your pelvis and just push gently. You'll do this, you'd come up. It's like a slightly lopsided seesaw, but you can see the difference here between that and actually leaning out, moving away from that center line. And go very carefully, as always, as you do this. Be careful of your knees and your back. So push up, and as you sink down, think of the hips going back and just observe what your upper body does. And then, almost like your pelvis for a bowl of water, you're going to scoop it under to scoop water into it. And again, observe what the shoulders and your head do and push up. And again. So we learn to move away from that center line without actually losing a sense of connection with it. You could argue that if I lean, my center of gravity is going forwards. If I tilt, my center of gravity remains above my legs. And that's all I need really to maintain stability. Now, next time you come up, your arms going out slightly, and then as your hips go back, they get drawn forwards. This is rowing a boat in the middle of the lake. Side. Don't concern yourself with how far your arms have to go forwards. If they go too far forwards, if you watch, if I think, right, I'm going to put my arms out there, I go back to leaning. So the movement is produced from here, from the center of your body, with the feeling of your arms being pushed out rather than straining in your shoulders your arms to stretch out. So the answer to the question, how far do your arms move, if that arises, is just enough. As far as they get moved, rather than thinking you've got to get them to a certain point. Rowing a boat in the middle of the lake. Now, do this one more time. And this time, again, I'll come a little bit closer so you can see. Imagine somebody's just taken hold of your belt or the top of your trousers, and rather than just pulling you back, they pull you to one side. So the front of your body faces on the diagonal. They're pulling you around like this, and then your hips go back, and you get pulled around and pushed up, and then go in the other direction, pulled around and up. So it's good to focus on this opposite movement and to feel that that's where the movement gets created from. And once again, your arms are moved by that, hands in front of you. Imagine your hands are on the table, and as your hips go back and your shoulders go forwards, your hands would just slide forwards. And as your hips are turned, the hands would go the opposite way. This is called polishing the table. One more in each direction. And then just come back to this standing position for a few moments. Take a couple of slow, gentle breaths. And shake out. Good. So, as I said earlier, nothing is imposed on the body. We're not trying to control our body with our mind. We're trying to cultivate these movements, and in particular to cultivate the interaction and the harmony between these three jewels. Everything in one sense is natural, which is why I said at one point, when we learn to focus our attention, we observe what the body is doing, and we observe how the body's doing a particular movement. And we may want to change that, but we don't want to impose a way of movement on it. So the term I like is cultivation. And in the same way that, if you've got a bush in your garden, or a tree or a rose bush or something like that, and it needs to be pruned, you don't just go in with an axe and go, right, I'm going to turn you into an oak tree or something like that. It's not going to work. The plant's going to die. But what you do is you look at it and you decide which way you want it to grow and where it's appropriate to trim and so on and so forth. And in the same way, we're not controlling the movements in our body with our mind. We're looking to cultivate this interaction of the three jewels, mind, body, awareness, really to a point where they no longer exist as separate entities. There's just you moving, and you is all of those three elements. And that's important, because sometimes people think this is about mind over matter, that you somehow discipline the body into doing something that it wouldn't do naturally. And any changes that we make must take into account of that. You might look at what I'm doing and say, oh, well, you know, kind of he's got his knees there or something. That's where I must put my knees. But what you should be thinking is, there's his knees, there's my knees. Now I need to plot a gentle route between the two in order to get there. So now, from this hip width stance, turn your right foot out, step forwards. And that's true whether you're thinking in terms of making changes physically or making changes in terms of the energy. It's always done with this aspect of cultivation. Now transferring your weight forwards and backwards. Again, going back to the pole. Yeah, I shall do it on the other side. You can see more easily. When I stand here, you see it's going down roughly through the crown of my head. When I go to here, much the same thing. So again, in the first instance, this happens, it moves with me. And you can see where the pole goes to. It will go, actually it will go to about there. It won't be quite where you think it ought to be. And when you go forwards, it's just around about here. Because you're getting about 70% of your weight in your back leg, about 60% in your front leg. It's great teaching online because I have things that I can grab and show things with. I found myself teaching a class the other day, and I wanted to talk about this, and there was a bit of me that was looking around for my pole, and I suddenly realised it was back at home. I wasn't able to show it. So there's definite advantages to doing online, I think. So your legs fill and empty. And what we want to do is to let, again, the pull of gravity work through the body. So it feels like when I get to my front leg, I sort of do this slightly. It isn't necessarily the case that you will bend your knees more, but there's this settling in process. Again, with a little bit of a pause. There's 70%, up to 70% in your back leg, up to 60 in your front leg when you go forwards. But now watch what happens. I'll go back to this. I go back to here. You can see the position of the pole. And then if I gently raise my front toes, it goes back a little bit. So a bit more of my weight goes back. And when I go forwards, I let my back knee bend in and the heel comes up. And again, the pole moves. So I move a little bit more closely to aligning that center line of the body over one leg or another. Front foot is now slightly turned out, and gradually more of your weight going into the supporting leg, the full leg. Until eventually, all we have left in the empty leg is just the residual weight of the leg itself. And it's at that point that we just bring the foot in. An interesting thing here for me is that moment of pausing actually enables the movement. So again, it's not either or, not just one thing, but rather this harmonization, this idea of the stillness within the movement, the stillness being an essential part of the movement. And then the other foot forwards. Back foot is turned out to a comfortable angle. Before we start to raise toes and heel, so just in the standard stance, front foot points straight ahead. So again, when I'm on the front foot, particularly hips, shoulders, knee, toes, all aiming in the same direction. You may find you get thrown off that a little bit going back. Don't worry about that. And then once again, raising your toes and your heel. And stepping in. Remember that the stability comes not from being able to balance, but by being able to allow yourself to soften, to make sure that your weight, your center of gravity drops down. So it may be useful to, actually it will be useful, whether you think you need it or not. It's actually quite interesting that I've just got my hand on the wall here gently. And that, that can provide that little bit of extra support and give you a chance to focus on that letting go a little bit more. And then if you're comfortable with this, especially if you're supporting yourself and you don't want to move away from it, carry on doing the initial exercise. Other than that, now, see, taking a few steps. When I go forward, my foot comes in, it swings out, the hip width, heel goes down, the toes go down. So it traces this semicircle, maintaining the width of the step. And then when you go back, or in the other direction, when the foot comes in, back and out, all of the foot goes down, heel goes down, go back. And as you get used to this, not only does the foot go down, but you apply that bit of pressure, so you're just pushing it into the ground to make sure of the ground beneath your feet before you transfer and commit your weight. And again, when we do that, we're taking shorter steps than we would normally take, and we're taking slower steps than we would normally take. So there's no need to lean. So as much as possible, I don't know if this is going to work actually. I maintain that center line while I'm in movement. I'm trying not to do this. As I've said before, in normal walking, we would naturally do that, and that's not a bad thing. But we want to, when we do that, we want to think about that difference. You know, if I walk along and I lean out to help me with the momentum, I kind of stumble and fall. If I walk along and I tilt, my center, I can begin to send my center of gravity forward with a bit more control. So the difference between this, we see my hips have gone back a little bit, and this is that I can maintain stability while I'm in motion, walking down the shops or something. So have your right foot forward, sink back, turn your hands palm out. Imagine a curved line from front to back, and move your weight forwards and rotate your arms, and your hands will just move along that curved line. As you go back, hands are just, rotation of the hands opens your chest, and then it closes. So your chest and indeed your upper back are part of this, but you'll see from the side, my hands stay more or less in the same position. They're not going there or there. They're just nice and easy and gently. So there's quite a lot of travel in your arms and your hands, but independently, they're not moving that far. This time, as you move back, keep your hands facing backwards. And as you settle into the back foot, you may find they swing out a little bit and then go forward. And as you settle into that front foot, they swing out just a little bit. Fisherman cast a net. So the arms move a little bit more when we find that moment of stillness in the legs. But again, we're not trying to put the arms in a particular position. They'll be moved by the momentum, the energy that builds up in the transfer of your weight and in the opening and closing of the chest and the upper back, and any other little connections and patterns of movement that you identify as you do the exercise. So you're throwing a sheet over a bed. And then sink back, bring your hands in front of your hips. Your chest opens, pushing your elbows out, turn your hands, pushing a wave or pushing a boat. The image itself lending a slightly stronger quality to the movement. And this, going back to something I said earlier, this stronger feeling from within the body through these sort of movements and these sort of images, gradually expand that out through the whole of the body. So it's a slow, gentle strengthening, conditioning of the body to produce this quality of internal strength, as we refer to it. One more time. And shake. Let's try those movements on the other side. So start in your back foot, hands facing forwards. So bird folds its wings. And then fisherman cast a net. Pushing away. Once more. And bring it down. Shake it. So rub your hands together. Fingers and palms get a little bit warm. And then tapping over your face very lightly. Over your head and neck. Using fingers, palms, or maybe even the hands fisted if that suits you better. Down to one shoulder. I tend to use the palm of my hand, but again, you could use the fist if that's better for you. And then down the inside of your arm, the outside. The other shoulder. And then with your hands very loosely fisted, working over the lower part of your back, around your hips and buttocks. It's very light there, obviously. And actually circle around your hips. And then down the outside of your legs and up the inside. Light on your belly. Again, I'm back to using the palms of my hands here. And then finally the upper part of the chest. Okay, so back to the parallel stance, feet hip width apart. And the closing exercise, as always, embrace tiger, return to mountain. So sinking down, pushing up, the body expands, contracts. Feel this contraction probably more in the chest to begin with. Still contracting, but now you feel your hips sinking down, the whole body contracting. And see if you can keep aware of that little sense of a pull on your hips, even as you push up. Again, it's like that elastic thread connected to your root. So that even in the act of pushing up and away from the root, the potential is there to draw you back. And again, there's this little sort of slight pause just here as you gather yourself to push out again. One more time. And brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. As always, if you have any questions, feel